Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from MisterWives, titled Our Own House. So here's a weird coincidence that I don't recall ever happening before when I've covered an act on this show. I actually saw this band live before getting their album and reviewing them. See, last year I managed to get tickets to go see Bleachers live in concert. Spoiler alert, it was incredible. And their opening act was an indie pop group called MrWives. The New York-based band had been getting a fair amount of traction through other tours, most notably with 21 Pilots, and American Authors, and a hot EP, and a good single. Heavily inspired by 80s synth-pop, they were a natural fit to open for Bleachers, so I wasn't really surprised there. But really, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed their set. Not only bringing a lot of energy, but with an eclectic sound incorporating horns with keyboards, jittery guitars, and frontwoman Mandy Lee Duffy's potent vocals. I remember thinking I should really take the time to review this band's album if and when they finally drop it. So flash forward 6 or 7 months, and MisterWives have finally dropped that debut album, and apparently have garnered enough real buzz in the industry to actually for me to get requests for it. So even despite some mixed reviews, I decided to check it out. What do we get? Well, honestly, it's pretty damn good. I'm not saying that it's great or mind-blowing or will rewrite the world of indie pop. If you got any familiarity with the better acts gaining traction in the scene right now, the success of MisterWives will not be surprising in the slightest. But you know what? It's a solid, lightweight debut that does deliver some good quality pop music that could easily gain traction on the radio for a single or two. And like most indie pop, the real highlights are lurking in the details. And while they do show some areas that they could definitely improve, they also do stand out amongst the crowd, and considering how oversaturated that crowd is, that's saying something. So let's start with the instrumentation and the production, the latter of which gets immediate credit from me for using the reverb properly and not suffocating the entire mix, instead applying it to add necessary atmosphere and deepening the percussion grooves. And really, groove is the key word with MisterWives. Between some of the more rollicking retro disco bass and guitar lines, sharply defined kick drums, and heavy usage of horns to drive the melody in a similar way that of Monsters and Men do, it lends the album a lot of brassy energy that's slick, upbeat, and relentlessly fun. Of course, MisterWives show off a lot of ideas with their debut, which leads to an instrumental mix that's eclectic, strikingly reminiscent of the genre bending that Lily Allen did on It's Not Me, It's You, her best album. And it leads to great moments like the exuberant trumpets and beat switch up on Not Your Way, the shimmering bounce of the early single Reflections, the meandering, washed out reggae of Oceans that really could have been tighter, but it did have some good steel drums that I liked, the muted and yet subtly gorgeous strings arrangement on Coffins, the tight rollick of the guitars that box around the sun, and that richer chorus that comes in for the final track, Queens. If I were to have issues with the instrumentation, they're pretty minor. Some of the keyboard lines could have been a little bit brighter. I wish that the sizzling guitar they used for noisier background texture could add a little bit more prominence. That's just the rock side of me. The mid-range of a couple songs can feel a little bit overstuffed with the blaring horns and the timbering, but oddly, this album feels like it builds momentum almost a little too well. It means that some of the tracks can feel draining thanks to the constant blaring horns and the energetic high tempo, which might have been the point lyrically of songs like Best I Can Do, but they can still be kinda exhausting to get through. This album is a short one, but it drains you. Now, part of this might have been Mandy Lee Duffy's delivery. Don't get me wrong, she's a really impressive singer, and the moments where she shows off her range and visceral power, like on Reflections, are some of the best moments on this album. But having her voice play the words very sugary pop songs, it's a bit of an odd choice. The easy comparisons for her are Ellie Goulding and Kimbra, with the more of the former's vocal timbre with the latter's theatrical energy, which is absolutely killer for more dramatic songs, which I wish there were more of on this album, but it adds a bit of a manic tinge to the more upbeat tracks, which make them feel a little bit overstated and overdone. Just didn't quite click for me. Now this necessarily takes us to the songwriting. And look, there's a limit to how much I'm really expecting here, because it is a debut album, and you can argue that the instrumentation does enough to distinguish them and allows them to stick a little bit closer to formula when it comes to lyrics, especially considering they're more of an indie pop group. And really, it's not that the writing is bad so much as it is kind of uneven, with a couple really great high points and a few areas that just strike me as a little bland, a little underwhelming. For example, Not Your Way attacks superficial standards of beauty better than Meghan Trainor's All About That Bass ever did, and levels a finger both at society and the fact that they still do buy into it when the prize is right and high enough, and they don't shy away from it, including themselves in the framing as the band, as they are just as culpable. Best I Can Do is very similar to this time on a strained relationship thanks to the guy having unrealistic expectations about the whole thing, and the girl's just exhausted and frustrated trying to keep them up, even though she really does want to. Sure, it's not quite as sharp as King of Anything by Sarah Bareilles, but it's still a pretty solid song that I liked. Lead single, Reflections, and the deep cut Coffins, they're both about breakups, but the emotions are played with a little bit more nuanced here, the former coming from the release of cutting off the last shreds of discomfort of an ex, the latter just a slow sputter of a relationship either between friends or a legit relationship of love, failing without really casting blame on either party. The framing on both these songs is really sharp in capturing those layers of nuance, and it works well with the loose overarching themes and metaphors of this album, many of which sound are image and illusions. Now, the general arc seems to imply that so much effort by people is spent maintaining those figments and illusions that it's often just so much more satisfying just to let them go and be honest with yourself and everyone else. And yet, there's often reasons why people maintain the illusions, either because of pain at their release, it just hurts too much, or their own seductive allure. Granted, songs like the sugar high of No Need for Dreaming and Box Around the Sun do push that euphoria to the absolute limit for me, and Hurricane easily falls into the traditional Outcast anthem territory that will inevitably soundtrack a young adult movie adaptation someday. But you know what, I do like how the album ends with Queens. On the surface, it's just another New York anthem about following one's dreams in the big city, as if we haven't heard that before, but the noisier guitars and the more melancholic tone and delivery, it tears away the illusion to reveal a very potent populist spirit beneath the pop coating. It's easily one of the best high points on this album, and while I do wish the melodies were a little bit stronger and that song is a little percussion heavy, it operates as such a solid endpoint for the record that it redeems many of its flaws. I do really like that song. So at the end of the day, I really did like Our Own House by MisterWives. As I said, if you're familiar with indie pop, it's not charting new territory, but instead it's honing and synthesizing disparate elements into a workable and unique sound. And with a strong performance and some good writing, I feel comfortable giving this a solid 7 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation. Yeah, there are points where it's a little bit too excited to be here for its own good, but if you're looking for an accessible, genuinely fun indie pop record, Our Own House by MisterWives, fun addition to the genre, definitely worth a look. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there are any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.